The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered, even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words.
Good morning. The last talk I gave a month or so ago, I talked about living in Blurrsville on a never-ending Blurs day. And then Rob emailed me from San Diego and said he thought I had coined the word Blurrsville, so maybe. When we wake up from that fog, or when the sirens of current events penetrate and we peer out, our world is the opposite of a blurry fog. It's a time of calamity, catastrophe, and very dark shadows. And change is both too slow in the shutdown and too fast with all the movement of pandemic and economic change and so forth. Raging illness, economic trauma, increased suffering, both of especially poorer and darker people. The climate crisis with its droughts and storms and fires. It's a calamitous time. Not only that, but it is that. And so I was reminded of one of my favorite classics called Hojoki, sometimes translated as Visions of a Torn World. It was written by a Japanese poet named Kamo no Chome in about 1200 in Kyoto. It's where in Kyoto, which was the capital of Japan, in the course of less than a decade, there was a whole series of disasters. First, a fire that raged through the city. And he writes, flames driven by unrelenting gusts flew whole blocks. Some, suffocated by smoke, fell upon the ground. Some, swallowed by flames, died at once. Some, scarce able to save themselves, lost all their worldly goods. And then 3 years later, a huge tornado rampaged through the entire city. And he writes, the din was so intense, no human voice could be heard. The very winds of hell must be this loud. Houses destroyed, gates and fences tossed into the sky. Many people maimed trying to save their homes. And the emperor and the court were so unnerved by this that they impetuously moved the capital out of Kyoto. They sort of floated the capital down the river and set up where they had to dispossess a lot of people from their homes and fields and sort of started over, building new homes. People had to abandon their homes in Kyoto, and which they had presumably rebuilt and moved downriver. And he writes, everyone felt adrift. It was a whole new crisis. They felt like clouds. Confusion and anguish filled the hearts of all and grew so intense that the capital was moved back again within a year. Yeah. And just a year after that, a famine, a 2-year famine. He writes, a famine brought such misery. First there was drought, then gales and floods. Finally, the crops failed. Clamor of suffering and sorrow filled the air. And then before the famine even ended, on top of it all, a great plague broke out and stood the world on its head. Even as you watched, stricken people walking by would suddenly fall. Probably the suffering of the famine had made people more prey to the plague. And then 3 years later, when the much reduced populace had regained some order, a great earthquake shook the earth. Mountains fell and filled the rivers. The seas heaved and flooded the land. All in 1 decade. Like this Kyoto poet in 1200, we don't just receive shocks and hunker down, we create narratives to make sense of it all. We construct stories about our life, about ourselves, and we move into these narratives. We furnish them, identify with them, and defend them. So one big story is ownership. We don't really own anything, but we have a very strong story about owning. It's a construct like success or failure or wealth or entitlement, like deserving or not deserving. These are stories about ourselves and our world. So we construct these stories sometimes on our own and more often following blueprints handed to us. And these constructions become the framework or architecture of our lives. They are intended, as our stories go, to help us make sense of life. But then probably most of you know the story of the sorcerer's apprentice who half learns a spell to control things, and his master leaves and says, you must fill all the buckets, the cistern in the house with buckets from the river, and of course you must not use any magic. And the master leaves and the young man says, but I know that spell. And he makes the spell in which the broom will carry the buckets of water, but he doesn't know how to undo it. And by the time the master returns, the whole place is deeply flooded, right? So our stories don't do our bidding. We set them in motion like the broom. And then they take center stage and they take charge. They sometimes even bully us because we believe in them and rush around filling their demands as our demands because we have identified with our stories. So there's nothing wrong with making stories about reality. It's not wrong to have stories. It can't help it. It's sort of essential, but they wield such power, like society. Now there's a very powerful story. Then there's who I am, very powerful story. And then in accepting them, we don't notice that they are only stories about. We don't pay attention to their agendas. But we live in terms of them as though they were immutable truths and just how it is. And we live that way to our great peril. I think many people have read Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens. Quite an interesting book, interesting popular science book. He has some very nice points. And one of the things I think was one of the strongest points in his book is his way of exploring stories about reality. He gives the example of Peugeot. You know, there are factories, there are workers, there's stockholders, there's an emblem on the front or back of a car, but there's no such thing as a Peugeot. Peugeot is a story, a grand, multifaceted story. Google is a story. The stock market is a story. This week, a calamitous story. Didn't behave the way it's the people who think they run it would like it to behave. Being American is several stories. So story doesn't mean to belittle these things, but just to see them as they are. Now, Harari doesn't ever in his book use the word emptiness. But by the end of the book, it's very clear that he's a practicing Buddhist. He talks about sitting and he talks about the Eightfold Path. And he's found in the word story, in the concept of story, an accessible word for emptiness. So story really is a great way to describe emptiness. We live and die by our stories. And at the same time, they are empty of any permanence or any solidity or any own being. as a species, we're always trying to make meaning. The world would be completely chaotic if we didn't do that. We see and we patterns and we elaborate them and we elaborate meaningful connections. We're weavers. We're all of us weavers. And it's an essential activity. But then we tend not to examine very closely the lens we bring to bear, the bias with which we choose what fits in a pattern for us and how they are connected. It seems natural to us, but every narrative of our pattern we see has things we've chosen to not take into account. We said they are not relevant or important enough to be part of this pattern. That's a bias. And necessary bias, because a pattern has to eliminate some things and include other things. But we don't notice the bias and often the agenda behind that bias. And then once we have a nicely filled out narrative and patterns of meaning, we identify with them, we cling to them, and we defend them. So again, stories aren't wrong. They're not a problem. They're just stories, ideas. And to not see that about them is very dangerous, painful. So some are grand overarching stories, like Indra's net. And some are very harmful, like conspiracy theories. Or the covert belief that each one of us has that we actually will never sicken and die. Intellectually, we say otherwise, but we all have a story of ongoingness because we really don't know anything else. So we naturally have a bias towards seeing ourselves going on indefinitely, if not forever. So Indra's net is a story about reality, about a universal truth, about the interwoven nature of all life and all things. It doesn't tell us what pattern to see. It says this is all a pattern of deeply interconnectedness. So Indra's net is a story that illustrates reality and makes it more understandable. But don't attach to being a jewel in that net, because then you're identified with the story. And likewise, impermanence isn't a story. It's a universal reality that we call by many names and make many stories about in our efforts both to meet it and to deny it. Now, our views and opinions are stories. Our values are qualities, but then we make, in order to have a value, to have it be who we are, to embrace it, we have to have a story about it so that we can make sense of it in terms of our life. So I always have had a value of thinking racism is wrong and of not being racist. And then as I graduated, that's a value. But then as I gradually saw that racism and racist policies and ideas are a very powerful force, I saw that that's really very passive. It is not really an adequate response. So this powerful force calls for an active expression of that value, and that's anti-racist for me. But my story that I wasn't racist, the more I embraced an active position or engagement of anti-racist, the more I saw all these racist ideas and views bubbling up inside me. They'd been unconscious when I was just not racist, but when I have an active, different story that now I see as a much more productive story, it's also somewhat a very painful story, because I see the world around me, the country around me, and I see myself. And I found in this Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, very helpful, because he walks the reader through his own journey into anti-racism, and through that seeing his racist ideas. And it was much easier then to acknowledge my own and be able to let them bubble up. So now my story that I'm an anti-racist includes that I have racist ideas or views buried that will keep bubbling up, and that my activity or my value of being an anti-racist starts at home and continues out. So I'd like to go back to Hojoki, because it's a story first recording catastrophe and then coming to grips with it. Coming to grips not with catastrophe, but with being ephemeral, which was the lesson Kamo no Chome learned from those catastrophes. His small book, he didn't exactly, he was a poet, but he wrote it as more of a story, a tale, with very poetic language, being a poet. And it opens with an image of impermanence and time that I've quoted before. It's one of the most quoted opening lines for any Japanese. If you start to say that first line, will know it. The flowing river never stops, and the water never stays the same. Foam floats where the current pools, scattering, reforming, and never lingering long. So it is with people and all their dwelling places here on earth. Impermanence is a reality. Time is a story. It's a construct. Right? It's a framework we lay onto impermanence and flow or movement, whatever you would call it, as part of our way of making sense of it. It's useful. It's one of the, but this construct, hours, days, years, centuries, they're a grid we impose on something that's flowing. So we take what is flowing and we chop it up into pieces, and then we don't really notice that. We are time happening, and we are objects opposed to time. And this is one of the deep contradictions of our lives. We see time when we look past the hours and the little boxes. We see time as a river, as an arrow, as wind. We feel time working on us. But time is us. It's who we are. It's what we are. We are always moving, and we often feel like clouds being blown by the wind. But we really don't know time, wind, or clouds at all, as Joni Mitchell said so memorably. So we have to go on looking at time from both sides, from up and down, from both sides, always changing in a changing world. So our very view of impermanence, our view of what time is, has to keep changing. Well, it doesn't have to, but if it doesn't keep changing, we wind up stuck and inert and very much out of sync. So you can't rely on impermanence to favor you or to hold still for you. So there's a Zen Soto classic teaching called the Shushogi that says impermanence is unreliable. We don't know on what roadside grasses the dew of our transient life will fall. Our bodies are not our own. Our lives shift with the passing days and cannot be stopped for an instant. Actually, I agree with much of this, but impermanence is not unreliable. Impermanence is very reliable. It never fails. And it is us. What it doesn't do is favor us or do our bidding. So Dharma practice must be based on investigating impermanence, going beyond our daily uncertainty, which is mostly a matter of our misunderstanding. Our fear and uncertainty are based on our thinking of ourselves as deserving of permanence and thinking that permanence would be peace, because we feel so unstable in our way of living with impermanence that surely permanence is peace. But life is impermanence and beauty is there. And much of our practice is about seeing through the apparent contradiction between change and peace. Our practice is to learn ever more what it is to be engaged with change and with the body and mind's resistance to it. And this seeing through our stories and accepting impermanence are neither depressing nor nihilistic. To the contrary, this is the way of openness. This is a curious mind and a loving heart. Now, Kamo no Chome, the author of Hojoki, personally lived through all those disasters, so he was able to write very ripely, very juicily about it. And then after walking us through all his impressions of it, he says, for a while after, there was talk of the vanities of this world, and people seemed to be rid of the sinfulness in their hearts. But days and months went by, then years, and no one spoke of it again. He offers a pretty bleak critique of society. He says, so as we see, our life is hard in this world. We and our houses are hollow, fleeting. The poor are shamed by the rich, the powerful are greedy, and people of means have much to fear. If you conform to the world, he says, it will bind you hand and foot. If you do not, then it will think you mad. And then he pivots and says, and so the question, where should we live and how? Where to find a place to rest for a little while? And how bring even short-lived peace to our hearts? And then he tells us what he did with these questions. In response to his calamitous life and home, he left it decisively. He became a monk and moved into the wooded hills outside Kyoto. And he built a hut, Hojoki, because Hojoki actually means 10-foot square hut. And he tried to face life. And the rest of his tale is about his life as a monk. Now, in his time and place, a person could either be in society or leave it behind. You couldn't do both. There was no middle ground. And we're very fortunate, which we sometimes forget because we feel so crushed by the many demands on us. We're very fortunate in our time to be able to combine life in the world with our practice of reflection, insight, compassion, and awakening. So we'll take Kamo no Chome as speaking for, in a sense, for the monk in us, for that side that reflects quietly. And he says, I built a little hut, a leaf from which the last drops of life might fall. In spring, wisteria bloom like a purple cloud. In autumn, the voices of cicadas seem to grieve this husk of a world. Goes on, comparing my past life with the present, your reality depends on your mind. Birds love the woods, he says. If you're not a bird, you will not know its truths. A quiet life is much the same. How would anyone know it without living it? But he doesn't stop there. he also sees himself caught up in a new round of story making. He says, and yet the way I love this hut is attachment. To be attached to the quiet and serene must also be a kind of burden. So our story building blinds us unless we keep a parallel process going of deconstructing our prized views and beliefs, reminding ourselves that views, while useful, are limited and necessarily biased, and they are empty. They are not meant to be clung to. Kamo no Chome ends his account saying, "This is what I asked myself. You left the world to live in the woods, to quiet your mind and live the holy way. But though you appear to be a monk, your heart is soaked in sin. Has your discerning mind just served to drive you mad? To these questions of mine, there is no answer. So now I used my impure tongue to offer a few prayers to Amida Buddha, and then silence." Some commentators have said, oh my goodness, his life as a monk drove him mad, but a terrible way to live your life. He's repudiating it by saying, this can drive, I must be silent. And it's really, of course, quite the opposite for someone who has known quiet in their lives in this way, this kind of reflective quiet. It's painful to keep widening our view, just as it's painful not to. It's painful to encompass the darker truths of our own lives and of our world. But that is our task. The Buddha way essentially offers teachings and values to support us in this painful endeavor, rather than living a painful endeavor that's kind of narrow and shut down. This is our task as people who care, as people, as followers of the way. Kamo ends his account with his return to silence. And when my teacher Katagiri Roshi published his first book called Returning to Silence, there was nothing depressing in that. This was a call to return to the inner quiet where we can see more clearly. It's a book of great love and warmth. So Kamo is engaging again in emptying his stories, letting them go, and needs silence in order to include what is difficult to face. So a modern Soto teacher I know, Cohn France, recently said in a talk, Zen is a path of disillusionment. Letting illusions go, or even sometimes escorting them out the door, we gain clarity. And of course, our fertile minds create new stories, maybe better stories, and that's, of course, another story. We do refine or even perhaps improve our stories through life. And that's a good thing. That's maturing. But that doesn't change the fact that they are stories, myths that we adopt, but that we live by at our peril. So a path of disillusionment is a path of growth, of seeing through our illusions, letting them go, and finding ground in the path itself, so that the new stories that emerge incorporate what we knew and what we have learned from letting go of what we had identified with. We take refuge as Buddhists in a path, in a journey, not in a doctrine. The path of disillusionment is not a path of despair. It's a path of awe and curiosity. It's a path of the loving heart and the inquiring mind. At the very beginning of his teaching career, Shakyamuni described his enlightenment in this kind of way, among other ways. He described it in many ways. It's fascinating. So he said, seeking but not finding the house builder, I traveled through rounds of countless births. Oh, painful is birth ever and again. House builder, you have now been seen. You shall not build the house again. Your rafters have been broken down. Your ridgepole is demolished too. My mind has now attained the unformed nirvana and reached the end of every kind of craving. Shakyamuni broke up in a permanent way. That's why he is a Buddha. In a permanent way, the rafters of the house of the self-serving self, the ego self, the self of me, the self of craving, of hatred, of ignorance. That self he dismantled, never to be erected again, leaving him free for a lifetime of teaching and meditating with a self that was process and exploration, that was wisdom and love. So we're not Buddhas. We will keep erecting houses and stories. And our path is the path of holding them lightly, enough that we can see through them, refine them, drop them, rebuild better and perhaps more flexibly, not dwelling in those houses as though they were some solid reality. I would like now to do an experiment with you. Instead of, we usually break up into small groups at the end and have conversations that are sometimes quite lovely. They're rather like the ones we would have when we leave the Zendo from a Dharma talk and we gather in little groups and chat with each other. It's warm and it's nice. What I want to do here is a little different. I'd like to ask us all to go into small groups that Koren Dojin will set up, groups of 3 for 10 minutes with a question, a topic, and each to speak for 3 minutes while the other 2 listen. It's best if we only have 3 people so that it keeps moving. So one person speaks for 3 minutes and the others listen. No questions, no crosstalk. We listen open-heartedly. And then the second person speaks, and then the third, and then we come back. And Koren Dojin will tell us when 3 minutes and 3 minutes more are up. So here's the question I want to pose. How does it feel to you to see your views, your values, and society as stories? How does this idea that all of these views, values, and society are stories, how does that feel to you? Okay.